Let me start with something uncomfortable. Trying to be smart is often the dumbest thing you can do. Not learning, not thinking, not understanding, trying to look smart, because the moment you decide your job is to appear intelligent, your brain stops doing the one thing it was built for, figuring things out. People with high IQs fall into this trap all the time. They're praised early, labeled gifted, told they're special, and slowly, very slowly, they learn a dangerous lesson. If I don't understand something right away, something must be wrong with me. So instead of asking questions, they fake it. Instead of admitting confusion, they hide it. Instead of learning, they protect their image. That's not intelligence. That's fear wearing a suit. Real understanding is messy. It's embarrassing. It involves saying things like, I don't get it, and that makes no sense, and wait, why does that even work? But if your identity depends on being the smart one, you can't afford to say those things. So you memorize, you repeat fancy words, you nod at explanations you don't actually understand. And everyone claps while you quietly get dumber. Here's the strange truth. Nature doesn't care how smart you think you are. Reality only responds to whether your ideas actually work. You can have the highest IQ in the room and still be completely wrong. And you can sound simple, almost naive, and be exactly right. The universe is under no obligation to match your self-image. That's why the best thinkers don't try to be clever. They try to be clear. They reduce ideas until nothing confusing is left. They test their understanding by explaining it simply. They enjoy being wrong because being wrong is how you discover what's right. High IQ becomes a trap when it turns into a shield. A shield against curiosity, a shield against doubt, a shield against learning. The smartest move you can make is to drop the act. Ask the stupid question. Explain things like you're talking to a child. Admit when you don't know, because the goal isn't to feel intelligent. The goal is to understand something true. And the moment you stop trying to be smart, that's when real intelligence finally shows up. Most people don't realize this, but the moment you start trying to look smart, your ability to actually think begins to decay. It happens quietly, almost politely. You stop asking certain questions. You stop admitting confusion. You start choosing words not because they are accurate, but because they sound impressive. And without noticing, you trade understanding for performance. When someone's identity becomes tied to being intelligent, every conversation turns into a stage. Ideas are no longer tools for figuring things out. They become props. The goal shifts from discovering what's true to maintaining an image. That shift is small at first, but it's fatal to learning, because real thinking requires vulnerability, and image requires protection. Understanding anything deeply means passing through a phase where you feel ignorant. There is no shortcut around that. Yet people who care about appearing smart treat confusion like a threat. Instead of slowing down and examining what they don't understand, they rush to cover it up. They nod along. They repeat phrases they've heard before. They use complexity as camouflage. This is how smart people get trapped by their own reputation. They stop exploring and start defending. They memorize explanations rather than building them from the ground up. They prefer impressive language over accurate language, and because others around them assume they know what they're talking about, the illusion survives, sometimes for years. The problem is that complexity is cheap. Anyone can make something sound complicated. You can hide uncertainty behind technical terms and abstract language, and most people won't challenge you. But clarity is expensive. Clarity requires that you remove every layer of confusion until only what actually matters remains. That process is uncomfortable because it exposes what you don't know. Trying to look smart also kills curiosity. Curiosity asks annoying questions. It interrupts. It says, wait, that doesn't make sense, even when everyone else seems satisfied. But if your self-worth depends on appearing knowledgeable, curiosity becomes dangerous. Questions risk revealing gaps, so instead of asking them, you suppress them. And a mind that stops asking questions stops growing. Ironically, the people who make the most progress are often the ones least concerned with their image. They're willing to say something clumsy. They'll explain an idea in plain language, even if it sounds childish. They don't mind being corrected because being wrong isn't an attack on who they are. It's just part of the process. Reality itself is brutally indifferent to how smart you think you are. It doesn't reward confidence, vocabulary, or credentials. It only responds to whether your ideas match how things actually work. You can sound brilliant and still be wrong. You can sound simple and be exactly right. Nature doesn't care about your performance. The tragedy is that many capable minds never reach their potential not because they lack intelligence, but because they're too busy protecting it. They confuse looking smart with being effective. They avoid the discomfort that real thinking demands, and in doing so, they slowly trade depth for polish. The escape is surprisingly simple, but not easy. Stop performing, slow down, ask the obvious question, use ordinary words, test your understanding by explaining it as clearly as possible. Accept the moment of not knowing without panic or shame. The instant you stop trying to look smart, you give your mind permission to do what it was meant to do. Figure things out. High IQ becomes a problem the moment it stops being a tool and turns into an identity. At first, it feels like an advantage. You're praised for being quick. Things come easily, at least in the beginning. You're told you're gifted, different, ahead of others. Over time, those compliments harden into a quiet expectation. You're supposed to understand things faster than everyone else. And that expectation changes how you think. When intelligence becomes who you are, failure stops being informative and starts feeling personal. Not understanding something right away doesn't register as a normal part of learning. It feels like evidence that the story about you might be false. So instead of engaging honestly with confusion, you try to outrun it. You skim instead of studying. You guess instead of testing. You avoid situations where your limits might be exposed. This is how high IQ turns into a trap. It rewards speed over depth. Being quick feels safer than being thorough. If you can arrive at a plausible answer fast, you don't have to sit with uncertainty. But speed is not the same thing as understanding. Many deep ideas only reveal themselves slowly, after you've made several wrong turns. A mind trained to value immediate correctness often gives up before that happens. There's also a subtle social pressure that comes with being labeled intelligent. People expect you to have answers. They defer to you. They assume you know what you're talking about. That external validation becomes addictive. And once you get used to it, you start optimizing for it. You choose paths where you can stay ahead rather than paths where you might struggle and grow. Over time, this creates a fragile kind of confidence. It looks solid from the outside, but it depends on never being challenged too hard. The moment a problem resists your usual tricks, anxiety appears. Instead of slowing down and rebuilding your understanding from scratch, you feel the urge to protect your status. You might dismiss the problem as unimportant, or hide behind abstraction, or blame the explanation instead of examining your own understanding. The most dangerous part is that this often goes unnoticed. High IQ individuals can function very well for a long time using pattern recognition and surface-level reasoning. They sound convincing. They perform well in discussions. But because they rarely push into areas where they feel truly lost, their growth plateaus. They mistake fluency for mastery. Real understanding doesn't care how fast you are. It demands patience, repetition, and humility. It asks you to break ideas apart and rebuild them in your own words. That process is slow and often uncomfortable. You have to admit what you don't know, even to yourself. If your identity depends on being the smart one, that admission feels threatening. The irony is that letting go of the identity doesn't make you less intelligent. It makes you more capable. When you stop protecting the label, you become free to explore difficult ideas without fear. You can take on problems that don't yield quick rewards. You can sit with confusion long enough for real insight to form. The strongest thinkers are not the ones who never struggle. They are the ones who are willing to struggle openly. They don't measure themselves by how quickly they grasp something, but by how deeply they understand it. They use intelligence as a tool, not as a shield. High IQ is useful. But the moment you cling to it as proof of your worth, it starts working against you. The mind grows most when it's allowed to be a beginner again. Curious, patient, and unafraid of not knowing, memorization often looks like intelligence from the outside. But most of the time, it's just a clever disguise for not understanding. You can repeat definitions, formulas, and explanations perfectly and still have no idea why any of it works. The danger is that memorization feels productive. It gives quick feedback. You can test yourself and get answers right. That sense of progress is comforting, especially when real understanding feels slow and uncertain. When people are afraid of not knowing, memorization becomes a safe place to hide. Instead of wrestling with an idea until it makes sense, they collect facts and phrases like trophies. They learn the language of a subject without learning its logic. And because fluent speech sounds convincing, both they and others mistake this fluency for depth. The problem shows up the moment the situation changes. As long as questions stay familiar, memorized knowledge performs well. But introduce a slightly different problem or ask for an explanation in plain language, and the structure collapses. Without true understanding, there's nothing to adapt. You can't reconstruct the idea from first principles because you never built it that way. Memorization encourages passivity. You accept information as something handed down, something to be stored, not something to be questioned. You focus on what instead of why. Over time, this trains the mind to stop probing. It becomes satisfied with surface-level answers as long as they sound correct. Curiosity fades, replaced by the goal of recall. There's also a social reward attached to memorization. People who can quote complex ideas or use technical language are often treated as knowledgeable. That reinforcement makes it tempting to double down. Why risk struggling through confusion when repeating what others have said earns approval? Slowly, the habit forms. Don't understand, recite. But understanding behaves very differently from memorization. Understanding is active. It forces you to take an idea apart, examine its assumptions, and test whether it actually makes sense. You can't fake that process, even to yourself. When you truly understand something, you can explain it in your own words, adjust it to new situations, and spot when it's being misused. The discomfort people feel when asked to explain something simply is revealing. If an idea exists only as a memorized structure, simplifying it feels like stripping away its protection. The jargon is gone. The safety net disappears. What remains is either a clear mental model or nothing at all. That moment of exposure is what many people unconsciously avoid. Memorization also creates the illusion that knowledge is finite and owned. Once you've stored enough facts, you feel complete. But real understanding is never finished. It deepens as you revisit ideas, notice inconsistencies, and connect them to other things. It's a living process, not a collection. This is why people who rely heavily on memorization often struggle when they encounter genuinely new problems. Without a script to follow, they feel lost. They search for something familiar to repeat instead of reasoning from scratch. And when that fails, frustration sets in. Letting go of memorization as the main strategy is unsettling. It means accepting slower progress. It means being wrong more often. It means admitting, I don't actually understand this yet. But that admission is the doorway to real learning. Once you replace memorization with understanding, knowledge becomes flexible. You're no longer trapped repeating what you've been told. You can think, adapt, and create. And that's the difference between sounding smart and actually knowing something. Real learning begins at the exact moment most people try to escape, the moment of embarrassment and doubt. When you don't understand something and feel that uncomfortable tightening in your chest, your instinct is to move away from it as quickly as possible. You change the subject, look for a simpler task, or pretend you're following along. That instinct feels natural, but it's the enemy of growth. Doubt is not a sign that you're failing. It's evidence that your mind has reached the edge of what it currently knows. Every meaningful idea lives on the other side of that edge. If you never feel unsure, it's not because you're mastering everything. It's because you're staying within familiar territory. Embarrassment plays a powerful role here because learning is social. From an early age, mistakes are noticed, corrected, sometimes laughed at. Over time, many people learn to associate being wrong with being exposed. They start to believe that not knowing something lowers their value in the eyes of others. So they build defenses, they speak less, they ask fewer questions, They choose safety over progress. But confusion is not a flaw in the process. It is the process. When an idea clashes with your existing understanding, right, our brain has to reorganize itself. That reorganization feels messy. Old assumptions break. New connections haven't formed yet. For a while, everything feels unstable. That instability is the price of learning something real. People who grow quickly aren't immune to this feeling. They simply respond to it differently. Instead of treating doubt as a threat, they treat it as a signal. Something here is worth attention. Something here doesn't fit. Rather than rushing past it, they slow down. They isolate the confusion. They ask simple, even clumsy questions until the fog starts to lift. This willingness to look ignorant, even temporarily, is a rare skill. It requires separating self-worth from performance. You have to accept that being wrong in the moment does not define you. It only defines where you are in the process. Once that separation is made, embarrassment loses its power. It becomes just another sensation, not a stop sign. Avoiding embarrassment has a hidden cost. Each time you skip over confusion to protect your image, you reinforce the habit of shallow understanding. You learn to move on without clarity. Over time, those gaps accumulate. You might function well enough, but the foundation underneath is weak. The moment you're asked to apply what you know in a new way, the cracks appear. Deep understanding, on the other hand, is built by repeatedly confronting what you don't know. It's forged through small failures that don't look impressive from the outside. Explaining something poorly, revising your explanation, and trying again. Asking a question that feels obvious and realizing others were wondering the same thing. Letting an idea sit unresolved until it finally clicks. The paradox is that the people who seem most confident in the long run are often those who were willing to feel uncertain in the short run. Their confidence isn't performative, it's grounded. It comes from having tested their understanding against confusion and survived. If you want to learn deeply, you have to make peace with the awkward phase. Expect it. Welcome it. When doubt appears, don't rush to escape it. Stay there long enough to learn what it's trying to teach you. The moment you stop fearing embarrassment is the moment learning stops being fragile. It becomes resilient, honest, and real. Cleverness is seductive because it feels like progress without effort. A sharp phrase, a witty insight, a surprising connection. These things create instant admiration. But cleverness often skips the hard part. It jumps to conclusions without building foundations. Clarity, on the other hand, is slow, demanding, and rarely flashy. Yet it is the only thing that lasts. When someone prioritizes being clever, they aim to impress. They look for shortcuts that produce quick recognition. Ideas become performances rather than tools. The focus shifts from making something understandable to making it sound impressive. That shift might earn praise, but it weakens thinking. Because an idea you can't explain clearly is an idea you don't fully control. Clarity forces confrontation. It asks you to define what you mean, to separate what you know from what you're guessing. Vague language can hide confusion, but precise language exposes it. That's why clarity feels uncomfortable. It removes the safety of ambiguity. Once you try to explain something plainly, you immediately see where your understanding breaks down. Clever explanations often rely on complexity to create authority. They use layers of abstraction, specialized terms, and elaborate structures. To an audience, this can sound deep, but complexity does not equal depth. In fact, unnecessary complexity is usually a sign that the thinker hasn't fully sorted things out. When you truly understand something, you can strip it down to its essentials without losing its meaning. Clarity also respects reality. It demands that your ideas match how things actually work, not how you wish they worked. You can't hide behind wordplay when clarity is the goal. Either the explanation holds up or it doesn't. This makes clarity a kind of honesty test. It reveals whether you're reasoning from solid ground or floating on intuition and habit. There's a reason simple explanations are so powerful. They're testable. You can apply them, challenge them, and see where they fail. A clear idea invites questions because it's exposed. A clever idea deflects questions because it's wrapped in cleverness. One leads to growth, the other leads to stagnation. Choosing clarity over cleverness also changes how you learn. Instead of racing to sound knowledgeable, you slow down to understand. You spend time asking basic questions. You try to explain ideas out loud or in writing until they make sense without decoration. That process reveals gaps, but it also fills them. Many people avoid clarity because they associate it with oversimplification. They fear losing nuance. But true clarity doesn't ignore complexity. It organizes it. It shows how simple principles combine to produce complicated outcomes. It doesn't flatten ideas. IT structures them. The most reliable thinkers aren't those who produce the most dazzling insights on demand. They're the ones who can walk you through their reasoning step by step without skipping anything important. They can tell you not just what is true, but why it's true. That ability comes from prioritizing understanding over performance. When you let go of cleverness, your thinking becomes sturdier. You may sound less impressive at first. You may hesitate more. But what you say will mean something. It will connect to reality and hold up under pressure. Clarity is not about being simple-minded. It's about being honest-minded. And in the long run, honesty outperforms cleverness every time. Reality has a way of cutting through illusion without mercy. It doesn't respond to confidence, credentials, or how impressive an idea sounds. It only responds to whether something actually works. When people protect their ego instead of testing their understanding, they delay this confrontation, but they can't avoid it forever. Ego wants safety. It wants consistency. It wants to believe that past success guarantees future correctness. Once you become attached to an image of yourself as intelligent, competent, or knowledgeable, every new challenge threatens that image. Instead of seeing problems as opportunities to learn, you start seeing them as tests of your worth. That's when growth slows. Protecting your ego often looks reasonable on the surface. You stick to familiar methods. You avoid asking questions that might expose gaps. You defend your opinions more fiercely than you examine them. None of this feels dishonest in the moment. It feels like confidence. But confidence that can't survive. Questioning is just fragility in disguise. Testing reality requires humility. You have to be willing to put your ideas in situations where they might fail. You have to accept feedback that contradicts what you believe. This is uncomfortable because it separates belief from identity. An idea can be wrong without you being wrong, but ego struggles with that distinction. When ego leads, reasoning becomes biased, evidence is filtered, contradictions are ignored or explained away. Instead of asking, is this true? The question becomes, how can I defend this? At that point, thinking turns into justification. You're no longer learning. You're protecting territory. Reality doesn't negotiate with justification. If an idea is flawed, it will fail when applied, no matter how convincing it sounded in theory. Systems break. Predictions miss. Results disappoint. And when that happens, ego offers excuses instead of insight. It blames circumstances, other people, or complexity itself. The alternative is to make testing more important than defending. This means treating ideas as experiments rather than possessions. You try them, observe what happens, and adjust. You welcome failure because it gives you information you didn't have before. Each mistake sharpens your understanding instead of threatening it. This mindset transforms learning. You stop trying to be right and start trying to get closer to the truth. Questions become tools instead of threats. Feedback becomes data instead of judgment. You don't need to pretend you know. You need to find out. People who adopt this approach often appear calmer and more confident, not because they know everything, but because their confidence isn't tied to being flawless. They trust the process. They know that errors will reveal themselves early if they test honestly. That trust creates resilience. Testing reality also forces clarity. Vague ideas can't be tested. Only specific claims can be checked against outcomes. So you're pushed to define what you mean, to make predictions, to state assumptions. Each step tightens your thinking. Ego resists this because clarity leaves no room to hide. Over time, this habit compounds. Small corrections accumulate into deep understanding. You develop intuition grounded in experience rather than assumption. You learn not just what works, but why it works, and when it doesn't. Letting go of ego doesn't mean lowering standards. It means raising them. You hold your ideas accountable to reality instead of applause. You accept temporary discomfort in exchange for lasting accuracy. In the end, reality is the final judge. You can either test your ideas willingly or let reality test them for you. The first path leads to growth. The second leads to surprise and regret.